And I think sometimes we need to raise our game with, perhaps people that are particularly sort of intellectual about a subject, or, like politicians that are used to interviews all the time. But yeah, Steinway's point, the common sense approach of, smiling and empathizing and showing that you're responding to what they say is a pretty straightforward and useful advice. More difficult, you asked more difficult questions. Yes, I think it makes sense to leave some of the harder things towards the end till you know that you've actually got a relationship going before you ask them perhaps the difficult, sensitive questions about their divorce or their private life. And certainly there's a special, a sort of an extra technique to probing where somebody's been misleading or evasive or sketchy. And sometimes, we've seen different models, perhaps on television interviews, of, like the famous sort of Paxman interview, of just putting the same question again and again, and the minister dropping themselves in the hole by just refusing to answer the question. Well, that doesn't work in every scenario. You've got to obviously adapt your technique to the problems that you're actually encountering. Sometimes just creeping up at a question from another angle is going to make a difference, and sometimes just the way that you don't let them off the hook. A classic example, if you like, and again, it takes a little bit of practice to avoid, for example, either asking very long questions where they lose the thread of what you're trying to ask, or if they're trying to avoid answering it, pick out one bit of it to answer. And that's a classic technique to watch out for with politicians. Don't give them a choice of questions, what do you think about this, and why was it that you did that? Because they'll always answer the easier of the two questions, and you've sort of lost a question in the ether, perhaps. So I think, particularly when you've got somebody that you're trying to put on the spot, I think keep the questions very short and ambiguous. And I think where possible, try to avoid distractions. It's generally speaking, not a good idea to interview people over food, because it's difficult to talk and eat for both of you, and usually it's not as much fun as it sounds. I certainly wouldn't have any problems about checking and double checking facts, and never being scared about just checking on the basics. I don't think I've ever been criticized by somebody for just double checking, and it may make you sound a little bit stupid initially, but John, how do you spell that? But you can bet that the one time you don't ask it, it's going to be Jon and not John, and you're the one that's going to be looking rather stupid. Final touches, well, sometimes it might be appropriate to ask a sort of catch-all, or what we call a bucket question at the end. Is there anything else that I should know? That sort of just that moment, what you might sort of call the wrap-up thing, just when they're relaxed and so on. Is there something you've completely forgotten? And sometimes that can throw up, surprises. And perhaps if you could double that up with what you might call the Columbo technique, if you've ever seen the detective series. There's an apocryphal story about a journalist interviewing a bride who's been jilted at the altar, and just as he stands up to go, she's obviously sort of looking a bit more relaxed, and he says sort of sympathetically, "Good luck for the future. I'm sure you'll have the courage to bounce back from this." And she says, "Oh, I'm sure I will. After all, it could never be as bad as the first time it happened." And suddenly, needless to say, the sort of journalist is sitting down again and asking more questions. So sometimes that Columbo thing, where people think it's all over and suddenly start relaxing, can suddenly throw up a last-minute revelation. Although I'm not suggesting that that will succeed in every situation. I think actually, Steinway, that there's a list of, you've asked about the name of books. We may already have done so, and we certainly are in the process of doing so, compiling a list of recommended books from all the tutors here, which you should be able to access through the main LSJ website. So after this, I'll double check on that. And certainly, yes, if you put in the name, you should pick it up on Amazon, and I see Lynham's chipping in on that one. So we're sort of, we've overrun slightly on time. And I think it makes sense perhaps to, at this stage, pick up on questions in a moment. The only thing that we haven't sort of dropped in, I think, at this point is also that some of the interviewing techniques that we're doing in perhaps a features profile, when we're trying to get underneath the skin of somebody and portray something of their personality, is we're interested in observational details as well. So we may be, in that kind of feature, interested in how they react to our questions. Are they looking uncomfortable? Are they looking, angry? Are they upset about something when they respond to us? And of course, in those kind of profiles, it physically makes sense to describe not just what they look like, but what sort of, how they present themselves. Are they the sort of guy that breaks our fingers when they shake our hand when we walk in? Do they come in looking, dishevelled and late and frantic and so on? And does that tell us anything about the sort of person they are? For that reason alone, those type of interviews are best conducted in someone's house, because it's less easy for them perhaps to dissemble than if they were in a public place or you meet them in a restaurant, where it's always just slightly easier for them to perhaps pretend to be something they're not. So perhaps full-length sort of features profiles is something we can discuss on another occasion. Given that we're over our time span here, what I should do is perhaps ask at this stage if you've got any sort of final questions. And although we've hardly, obviously just touched over the surface, just to pull together summarise what we've been saying, there are a few tips in there, but to summarise, much of the time we're looking for facts, for the who, what, when, why of what's happened to stand up our news stories. Some of the time we're asking very specific questions of spokespeople for environmental groups or charities or unions or employers to represent the views of hundreds or thousands of other people. Sometimes we're looking for eyewitness reports, vivid first-person accounts, and that would include sort of case studies of, what it was like to battle against a disease or what a particular experience was like, because it's more vivid in their language.